The door to the Jordan estate swung open before Stephanie could reach it. Zachary walked in like a man who already owned the floors beneath him. He didn't knock. He never knocked. He had the kind of confidence that only money could buy. The slow, deliberate kind that made a room feel smaller the moment he entered it. His coat was pressed. His boots were clean. His smile was the worst thing about him. Stephanie stood at the top of the staircase and watched him cross her father's entrance hall, his eyes moving across the furniture, the paintings, the mounted pelts along the wall. Not like a guest, admiring the home, but like a buyer taking inventory. She had seen that look before, on men who came to lowball her father's fur contracts, on bankers who smiled while they tightened a noose. She gripped the banister and descended slowly, because if there was one thing the Jordans never did in front of company, it was rush. She reached the bottom step and folded her hands in front of her, the way her mother had taught her. Still, composed, unreadable. Her mother. The thought cut through her chest like a blade, and she buried it before it reached her face. "Mr. Zachary," she said. Her voice was steady. She had practiced steady. V. He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and produced a folded document. He set it on her father's desk. Her desk now, though it still smelled like him, and smoothed it flat with 2 fingers. 30 days, he said. That's what I'm offering you, Stephanie. 30 days to make a sensible decision. She didn't move toward the desk. She didn't need to. She already knew what the document was. A marriage proposal dressed in legal language, with the Jordan fur trade buried in the fine print like a trap waiting to spring. Her parents had built that business across 30 years of honest work. Trapping seasons and trade routes and handshake deals made in the frost and mud of the Nebraska frontier. She had inherited it 6 months ago on the worst night of her life, and she was not about to sign it over to a man who smelled like cologne and ambition. "I've already made my decision," she said. He tilted his head. "You've made a prideful one. There's a difference." She looked at him the way her father used to look at men who tried to cheat him, not with anger, but with a cold, patient contempt that said she had already won and was simply waiting for him to realize it. "Get out of my house," she said. Zachary smiled. He folded the document back into his pocket and buttoned his coat. He walked to the door with the unhurried ease of a man who had never been refused anything that truly mattered to him. He paused with his hand on the frame and turned back just once. 30 days, he repeated. "I'd hate for something else to happen to this family." Then he was gone, and the door clicked shut behind him, and the entrance hall was so quiet she could hear the clock on the mantel. She stood there for a long moment. Outside the window, a rider moved at a slow trot down the street. She could see the badge on his chest catch the afternoon light. Sheriff Larry Dillon. He was watching the estate. Had he seen Terry leave? She turned away before he could look up. Some things she was not ready to deal with. The sheriff was one of them. That night the barn burned. The smoke woke her before the sound did. She was already moving by the time she reached the window. Already pulling on her boots before her mind had fully assembled the nightmare in the yard below. The barn sat at the far end of the estate, where her father used to store the cured pelts before shipment, and it was burning the way only a deliberate fire burns, fast and even, and from multiple corners at once, as though the darkness itself had decided to collect a debt. The horses were screaming. The hands from the bunkhouse were already running with buckets that would not be enough, had never been enough, could never be enough against a fire like this one. She joined the bucket line without thinking, taking the weight of each one and hurling the water and passing it back over and over until her shoulders burned and her lungs tasted of smoke, but it was already over before it started. She could see it in the way the fire moved, deliberate, confident, like it had been given permission. Months of cured pelts, the entire spring inventory. The Jordan name's lifeblood for the coming season, blackening and curling in the heat, becoming nothing. By the time the flames dropped to embers, it was past midnight. The hands drifted back to the bunkhouse, one by one, their faces gray with soot and the exhaustion of men who had fought something and lost. She stayed. She stood in the ash and stared at the skeleton of the barn. The beams still glowing orange at their edges, the roof collapsed inward, the walls her father had built with his own hands now, just black, ribs against the Nebraska sky, and she pressed her shaking hands flat against her thighs so no one would see. She heard the hoofbeats before she saw the lantern. Larry Dillon dismounted and walked toward her and stopped a few feet behind her, and she could feel him looking, not at the damage, not at the embers, but at her, and she hated it. She had no use for gentleness tonight. Gentleness made things harder to hold together. "You didn't have to come," she said, her eyes still on the ruins. "I saw Zachary leave your house this afternoon," he said quietly. She said nothing. He let the silence sit for a moment, then, "Stephanie, this fire didn't start itself." She turned around then and looked at him fully for the first time in the low orange glow of what used to be her father's barn. He was taller than she remembered from childhood, or maybe she had spent years making him smaller in her memory to make the dismissal easier. His jaw was set. His eyes were steady. There was no smugness in him tonight, just a man standing in the dark, looking at her like she mattered, and that somehow was worse. "I've been handling things alone since February," she said. "I buried my parents alone. I held this business together, alone. I have faced everything this year has thrown at me alone, and I am still standing. So with respect, Sheriff, I don't need you." She turned and walked back toward the house. The ash crunched softly under her boots. She did not look back, but she heard him, still there, not moving, standing in the dark beside the ruins like a man who had learned how to wait. "Now, let's take a break. If you're already feeling this story, if the image of Stephanie Jordan standing in the ash of her father's barn at midnight with a sheriff she never wanted watching her back is already living in your chest, then you're exactly who this story was made for. Go ahead and hit that like button. Subscribe if you're new, because what happens next is the kind of thing you don't want to miss. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one, and trust me, you're part of this journey too. Now, let's get back to Bellevue, because we have to know why Stephanie was never fond of the sheriff. Bellevue in 1865 was a town that knew its own order. There were families who owned things, and families who worked for the families who owned things. And nobody spoke about it because nobody needed to. It was simply the shape of the world, like the curve of the Missouri River or the angle of the afternoon sun. The Jordans sat at the top of that order without effort or apology. Their estate was the largest on the eastern edge of town. Their name was on the deed of half the commercial lots along the main street, and their fur trade supplied half the territory with the pelts that kept men warm through winters that could kill a horse. Stephanie grew up inside all of that like a girl inside a painting, beautiful, composed, and completely certain of her place in the frame. She wore dresses that her mother ordered from St. Louis. She rode a pale mare named Pearl that her father had bought from a rancher in Kansas. She attended the small schoolhouse on Birchwood Street with the other children of Bellevue's better families, and she carried herself the way her mother had taught her. Chin level, shoulders back, voice measured, never loud. She was not unkind exactly. She simply lived at a distance from certain things, from certain people, from the kind of boy who showed up to school with mud still drying on his boots and a look in his eyes like the world owed him something, and he intended to collect. Larry Dillon was 10 years old the first time she noticed him, and she noticed him the way you notice something out of place. A crack in a clean wall, a stone in a smooth road. He was the son of a man who worked the Jordan trade routes, hauling pelts from the northern camps down to Bellevue in a wagon that always seemed to be missing a wheel or a horse or both. He was loud where she was quiet, restless where she was still. He asked questions in school that the teacher hadn't prepared for, and laughed at things nobody else found funny, and took up space like he had every right to it, which she found, even at 9 years, deeply, personally offensive. He was not part of her world. He was adjacent to it, the way the Hand's children were adjacent to it. Present, occasionally visible, but not relevant. She had made her peace with that distinction, the way children make peace with the rules they inherit. Without examination, without cruelty, and without a second thought. Until the afternoon at the schoolhouse gate, she was 12, he was 13. She had been walking out with 2 girls from her class. Margaret Hale and Cicely Pratt, both daughters of merchants, both identically impressed by everything Stephanie did. When Larry fell into step beside them, uninvited, the way he always did everything, without hesitation, without permission, without apparent awareness that he was not wanted, he said something to her. She couldn't remember now, years later, what it was. Something easy, something with that grin behind it, the kind of comment that assumed familiarity where none existed. Margaret and Cecily went quiet, watching, and Stephanie, 12 years old and raised to understand exactly what her silence or her acknowledgement would mean in the social architecture of Bellevue, looked at him. Looked at his worn boots, his second-hand coat, his father's wagon waiting at the end of the road. And she said, clearly enough for Margaret and Cecily to hear, "I don't think we have anything to talk about." Then she walked on. Margaret and Cecily followed. And that was that. Except it wasn't, because she had looked back. Just once, just for a moment, the way you look back at something you've dropped. And she had seen his face, not wounded, not embarrassed, not the crumpled expression she might have expected from a boy who had just been put in his place in front of an audience. Just still, watching her go with an expression she hadn't had the vocabulary for at 12 and wasn't sure she had it for now. It wasn't anger. It wasn't humiliation. It was something quieter and more durable than either of those things. It was the face of someone who had just learned something true about the world and had decided, without drama, to remember it. She had forgotten about it by the following week. Or she had told herself she had. The way you tell yourself you've forgotten the things that sit in the back of your chest and wait. Now she was standing in the ash of her father's barn at past midnight with soot on her hands and that same man's footsteps fading behind her. And the memory was back, sharp and unwelcome and entirely too clear. She climbed the porch steps and pushed through the front door and stood in the entrance hall in the dark, breathing. The clock on the mantel ticked. Her father's coat still hung on the hook by the door. She hadn't been able to move it. 6 months, and she hadn't been able to move it. She pressed her back against the door and slid down until she was sitting on the floor, knees to her chest. The way she used to sit as a small child when the world was too large and too loud, and she needed the walls close around her. Outside, she heard his horse finally move, the slow, measured hoofbeats of a man who wasn't running, who wasn't leaving because he'd been dismissed, who was leaving because he'd chosen to. and would be back the same way, on his own terms, in his own time, without asking her permission. She hated that about him. She had always hated that about him. She pressed her forehead to her knees and sat there in the dark for a long time in her father's house, in her father's hall, underneath the weight of everything she had inherited and everything she had not asked for, and she did not cry. She had promised herself the night of the telegram that she would not cry again until this was over. She intended to keep that promise, but the floor was very cold, and the house was very quiet, and outside the Nebraska night pressed in from every direction like it was waiting for her to break. She didn't, not yet. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday. She remembered that detail with a precision that made no sense. The day of the week, the color of the sky that afternoon, the fact that she had been in the middle of reviewing a shipment manifest when old Mr. Cobb from the telegraph office appeared at the estate gate with his hat in his hands. Men only held their hats like that when the news inside them was the kind that changed everything. She had known before she unfolded the paper. She had known from the way Mr. Cobb couldn't hold her eyes. The words themselves were almost beside the point. A business trip to the northern camps, a mountain pass outside of Scott's Bluff, outlaws who had hit the supply wagon fast and clean and disappeared back into the hills before anyone could give chase. Her father and mother had been on that wagon. They were not on it anymore. She stood in the middle of her father's study with the telegram in her hand and the window light falling across her father's desk and her father's books and her father's maps of the trade routes he had spent 30 years building, and she read the words twice, and then she folded the paper very carefully along its original crease and set it down on the desk, and sat in her father's chair and did not move for a very long time. There was no one to call. That was the thing nobody told you about being the last person in a family. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the silence of a house that had been built for more people than were left in it. Every room suddenly too large. Every doorway a reminder of someone who used to pass through it. Her parents had no siblings living. Her father's business partners sent letters that were professionally warm and personally useless. The minister came and sat with her for an hour and said things about God's plan that she received with a closed face and an open contempt she was too exhausted to hide. The town came to the funeral in numbers that impressed her. Half of Bellevue turned out, because the Jordan name meant something, because her father had employed half of them at one point or another, because her mother had been the kind of woman people remembered. They filed past her at the graveside with their condolences and their casseroles and their careful sidelong looks, looks that she recognized even then, even in her grief, as the looks of people already calculating what the Jordan estate meant now that the Jordans were down to one. She shook every hand. She thanked every person. She did not break. And when the last of them had gone, and the grave was closed and the evening light was going orange across the Bellevue skyline, she walked back to the estate alone and sat down at her father's desk and opened his ledgers and started to learn, in the space of a single night, everything she did not yet know about running a fur trade empire on her own. There was more she didn't know than she had expected. Her father had sheltered her from the mechanics of it, not out of condescension, she understood now, but out of love, the particular love of a man who had worked himself half to death so his daughter wouldn't have to. The trade routes were complicated. The supplier relationships were personal, built on years of handshake whiskey and the kind of trust that didn't transfer automatically to a daughter who had never sat across table from a trapper in her life. The finances were stable, but not comfortable. Her father had been reinvesting heavily in expanding the northern routes, which meant the estate was cash-light in a way that wasn't visible from the outside but was very visible from the inside of his ledgers. She sat with those numbers for 3 nights straight. She learned them. She memorized them. She built in her mind a complete picture of the Jordan business, as it actually was. Not as she had imagined it from the comfortable distance of a privileged childhood, but as it truly was, with all its weight and all its fragility laid bare. And then she got to work. She wrote letters to every supplier. She met with every partner. She rode the Bellevue streets in her mother's black carriage, with her back straight and her face composed, and she shook hands and honored contracts and made it very clear to anyone who looked that the Jordan name was not available for the taking. She had been doing that for 6 months. When Zachary started coming around, at first it was social calls, polite, unremarkable, the kind of visits that a wealthy man of standing paid to a recently bereaved neighbor. She had received him the way she received everyone, with composure, with measured courtesy, with the careful distance of a woman who had too much to do to waste time on sentiment. But the visits had changed. They had become more frequent, more pointed. The conversation had shifted by degrees so subtle she almost missed them, from condolence to suggestion, gentle at first, then less gentle, then not gentle at all. He had opinions about the trade routes. He had concerns about her ability to manage the northern camps through the coming winter alone. He had, he said one afternoon, with that smile of his, a proposition that would solve a great many of her problems in one stroke. She had shown him the door that afternoon, too. She had been showing him the door for 2 months. He kept coming back, each time with the smile a little wider and the patience a little thinner, and she had understood. With the cold clarity of a woman who had spent 6 months learning to read the numbers behind the words, that he was not going to stop that. The visits were not visits. That the proposition was not a proposition. That Zachary had decided the Jordan estate was his, and that the only question left in his mind was how long it would take her to understand that. The barn fire had been his answer to that question, and now she sat in her father's chair in the small hours of a Nebraska morning, with ash still in her hair and the smell of smoke in her clothes, staring at the ledgers that told her exactly how much she could not afford to lose. And she understood, with a clarity that felt like swallowing glass, that the 6 months of handling things alone had just become something harder, something she had not planned for, something that was going to require more than composure and straight shoulders and a closed face. She pressed her hands flat on the desk. She looked at her father's maps. She thought about the man standing in the dark outside her barn, patient and unhurried, with that look on his face she still didn't have the right word for. She opened a fresh page in the ledger. She picked up her pen. She went back to work. It was all she knew how to do. Larry Dillon had been the sheriff of Bellevue for 4 years, and in those 4 years he had learned one thing above everything else, that the people who needed help the most were always the last ones to ask for it. He had seen it in farmers who let their debts swallow them whole before they'd knock on a neighbor's door. He had seen it in women who wore their bruises like secrets. He had seen it in old men who'd rather die in a burning house than admit they couldn't carry water anymore. Pride was the most expensive thing a person could own in a frontier town, and the Jordans had always owned more of it than most. Stephanie Jordan had more of it than all of them combined. He had known that since they were children. He had known it the afternoon, at the schoolhouse gate, when she had looked at his boots and his coat and his father's wagon and made her calculation with the cool efficiency of a girl who had been taught exactly what her acknowledgement was worth. He had not forgotten that afternoon. He had not forgotten the look on her face, or the silence of Margaret Hale and Cecily Pratt, or the way the world had arranged itself in that moment into a shape he recognized and hated and decided, standing there at 13 years old on a dirt road in Bellevue, Nebraska, that he would spend his life proving wrong. He was not sure he had proven it wrong, but he had the badge, and right now the badge was the only thing she couldn't refuse. He rode to the Jordan estate the morning after the fire, with a folder of documents under his arm and a patience he had been building for weeks. He had been watching Terry Zachary for longer than Stephanie knew. Not because anyone had asked him to, but because men like Terry Zachary were a particular kind of problem that Larry had learned to recognize early. They moved slowly. They worked through systems, lawyers and judges and paperwork, and the quiet pressure of money applied in the right places at the right times. They didn't leave fingerprints because they never touched anything directly. The barn fire was the first time Terry had moved fast, and fast meant rattled, and rattled meant he was closer to his edge than he wanted anyone to know. That was useful. Larry had spent the past 3 weeks building a file on Terry Zachary, land records, financial transactions, witness accounts from men who had done business with him in other towns, and what he had was not yet enough to take to a judge, but it was enough to take to Stephanie. Enough to make her understand that this was bigger than a marriage proposal and a burned barn. He tied his horse at the estate gate and walked up the path and knocked. He waited. He knocked again. The door opened and she was standing there in a dark dress with her hair pinned back, and her eyes clear and composed in the way that he had come to understand meant she had not slept. And she looked at him the way she always looked at him, like he was a problem she hadn't yet decided how to solve. "Sheriff," she said, "not Larry. Never Larry. Miss Jordan." He held out the folder. "I need you to look at something." She looked at the folder. She looked at him. Something moved behind her eyes. Not warmth, not welcome, but a calculation he recognized. She was weighing the cost of letting him in against the cost of sending him away, and he could see the moment the scale tipped. She stepped back from the door. He walked in. She did not offer him a seat or coffee, or any of the ordinary courtesies, and he did not ask for them. He set the folder on her father's desk and opened it and laid the documents out in the order he had arranged them. The land records first, then the financial transactions, then the witness accounts from Kearney and Omaha, where Terry had pulled the same slow suffocation on 2 other estates, for the owners had sold at a fraction of the value and disappeared. She stood across the desk from him and read. She read everything. She did not rush, and she did not react, and she did not give him a single thing to read on her face, which he had expected. What he had not expected was how long she stood there after she had finished. Hands flat on the desk, eyes on the last document, perfectly still in the way of someone absorbing a blow they had half anticipated but hoped wouldn't land. Then she straightened. She collected the documents into a neat pile. She pushed them back across the desk toward him. "This isn't enough," she said. "Not for a judge." "Not yet," he said, "but it tells us what he's done before, and it tells us what he's building toward." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the morning was gray and still. "The deed," she said, almost to herself. He looked at her. What deed? She met his eyes then, really met them, for the first time since he'd walked in, and something shifted in the room. Not warmth, not trust, but the first hairline crack in the wall she had been building since the moment she opened the door. "My father signed something," she said slowly, "before he left for the North. A financing agreement. Terry's lawyer brought it to me last month. I had my own lawyer look at it, and he said it was standard." She paused. "But my father never mentioned it to me. Not once." Larry held her gaze. "Where is it now?" "Locked in the safe. I need to see it." She studied him for a long moment. He could feel her weighing him. Not the badge, not the folder, but him, the man behind both of them. The boy from the dirt road, all grown up and standing in her father's study, asking her to trust him, with something she wasn't sure she could afford to lose. "I'll have my lawyer send you a copy," she said finally. It wasn't yes, but it wasn't no. He picked up his folder. He walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame, not for effect, but because there was one more thing, and he needed her to hear it plainly. "Stephanie." She looked up. "He's not going to stop with the barn. What comes next will be worse. I need you to understand that." She held his gaze without flinching. "I understand a great many things, Sheriff," she said quietly. "Understanding them has never been my problem." He nodded once. He left. He rode back to the jailhouse and sat at his desk and opened the folder again and stared at the documents and thought about the way she had said the word deed, almost to herself, like a woman pulling a loose thread and already knowing, somewhere deep and dreadful, what was going to unravel. The copy of the document arrived at Larry's office on a Thursday morning, delivered by Stephanie's lawyer. A thin, careful man named Aldous Crane, who set the envelope on Larry's desk without sitting down and said, with the particular discomfort of a man delivering news he wished belonged to someone else, that he had looked at the agreement again after Miss Jordan's request, and that he may have been too hasty in his initial assessment. Larry thanked him. Crane left. Larry opened the envelope and spread the document flat on his desk and read once quickly and then again slowly, the way he read everything that mattered. And by the second reading, the shape of it was clear enough to sit heavy in his chest. It was a financing agreement, as Crane had described, her father borrowing against a portion of the Jordan trade-out routes as collateral for a loan taken out 3 weeks before the trip north. The loan amount was significant. The interest terms were aggressive, and buried in the third page, in the kind of language that was designed to be read quickly and understood slowly, was a clause that said, if the borrower died before the loan was repaid, the collateral, the northern trade routes, the most valuable part of the Jordan fur operation, transferred directly to the lender. The lender was a land holding company registered in Omaha. Larry had seen that company name before. It had taken him 10 minutes to find where. It was in the folder he had built on Terry Zachary in the financial records from Kearney. The same holding company had appeared in both of the previous estate acquisitions. Terry Zachary didn't put his name on things. He never had. He worked through shells and proxies, and carefully worded agreements that looked like one thing and meant another. And by the time anyone understood what they had signed, it was already too late to unsign it. Larry sat with that for a long time. Outside his window, Bellevue went about its morning. Wagons on the main street, the smell of bread from the bakery. 2 doors down, the sound of children somewhere in the direction of the schoolhouse. Ordinary sounds, the sounds of a town that did not know what was moving through it. He thought about the timeline. 3 weeks before the trip north, Robert Jordan had signed this document. That meant someone had come to him, had approached him with an offer of financing, at a moment when the Jordan business was cashlight from the northern expansion, had made it seem reasonable, had made it seem like a standard arrangement between businessmen. And Robert Jordan, who had built a fur empire from nothing and was nobody's fool, had signed it, which meant either he had been deceived very skillfully or he had been pressured in a way that left him no room to refuse. Or, and this was the thought that made Larry set the document down and press his hands flat on the desk and breathe carefully. The trip north had not been as random as it appeared. He did not say that last thought out loud. Not yet. It was the kind of thought that needed evidence before it became words, because words like that, spoken too soon in a town like Bellevue, had a way of becoming fire. But he wrote it down in the small leather notebook he kept in his breast pocket. In the shorthand he had developed over 4 years of keeping notes he didn't want anyone else to read. Then he put on his hat and rode out to the Jordan estate. She was in the study when he arrived, which was where she always seemed to be. Bent over the ledgers with her sleeves pushed up and her hair slightly less composed than it was when she was expecting company, which told him she hadn't been. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway, and the composure snapped back into place, like a shutter closing, which he had also come to expect. "You've read it," she said. It wasn't a question. "Sit down," he said. Something in his voice made her sit. He laid the document on the desk between them, and put his finger on the 3rd-page clause, and watched her face as she read it. She read it twice, the way he had. He saw the moment she reached the same understanding he had, a stillness that moved through her like a cold wind, there and gone in a second, leaving the surface undisturbed but changing something underneath. She sat back. She folded her hands on the desk. She was quiet for long enough that the clock on the mantel marked it. "The northern routes," she said finally. Her voice was even, controlled. "He doesn't want the estate. He wants the routes." "The routes are worth 3 times the estate," Larry said. "The estate is leverage. The marriage proposal is leverage. The barn was leverage. Everything he's done has been to push you toward a position where signing that deed over to him feels like the only way out." She looked at the document. She looked at her father's maps on the wall. The careful lines of the northern routes her father had spent 30 years drawing. The camps and the river crossings and the supply stops marked in his handwriting. "My father didn't know what he was signing," she said. "He was deceived." "Yes, and the trip north." She stopped. She looked at Larry. He held her gaze and said nothing, because he didn't have the evidence yet, and he would not give her a theory dressed as a fact. But she was smart enough to read the silence. He watched something move across her face. Not grief, not fear. Something older and colder than either of those. Something that looked like the moment a person understands that the worst thing they have been afraid to think might actually be true. She pressed her lips together. She looked back at the document. "Can you prove the holding company is his?" "Not yet, but I know where to look." "How long?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. She nodded once, slowly, like a woman accepting a sentence. "In the meantime, he'll keep pushing," she said. "Yes, the accounts, the suppliers, anyone who does business with me." "Yes." She was quiet again. The clock ticked. Outside, the Nebraska afternoon was going gold through the window. She looked at her father's maps for a long time, with an expression he couldn't fully name, grief and fury, and something that might, in a different light, have looked like resolve. Then she looked at him. "Find the proof," she said. It was not a request. It was not gratitude. It was an instruction, delivered with the flat authority of a woman who had spent 6 months learning to run an empire, and had just decided, quietly and irrevocably, to fight for it. He picked up the document. He stood. "Lock your doors tonight," he said. "I always lock my doors," she said. He left. He rode back through Bellevue in the long afternoon light and felt the weight of what he now knew settling across his shoulders like a yoke. The document, the holding company, the timeline, the thought he had written in his notebook that he still could not say out loud. He had 4 years of experience telling him that men like Terry Zachary were dangerous, precisely because they were careful. And careful men, when they felt the net closing, had a way of becoming something else entirely. The letter from the bank arrived on a Monday. She read it standing at the front door. Still in her morning dress, the envelope not yet fully open, and she understood what it was before she reached the second line. Her accounts had been frozen, not closed, frozen. Pending a legal inquiry, the letter said, into the legitimacy of several recent transactions conducted under the Jordan business name. The language was careful and bureaucratic and entirely bloodless, the way the language of destruction always was when it came dressed in official stationery. She read it twice. She folded it. She walked back to the study and sat down, placed the letter on the desk in front of her, and looked at it the way you look at something you need to understand completely before you allow yourself to feel anything about it. She had 2 months of operating expenses in those accounts. Supplier payments due at the end of the week. 3 trade runs scheduled for the following month that required advance financing to outfit. Without access to those funds, the Jordan business did not slow down. It stopped. Not gradually, not partially. It stopped. The way a heart stops, all at once and without negotiation. Terry had not come at her with fire this time. He had come at her with paper, which was worse, because paper left no ash and no evidence, and no sheriff standing in her yard in the dark asking questions. Paper was clean. Paper was the kind of weapon that a man like Terry Zachary sharpened his whole life, and he had just put it through the center of everything she had spent. 6 months holding together. By Tuesday the staff knew. She hadn't told them. She wouldn't have. Not yet. Not until she had a solution to offer alongside the problem. But the supplier who had shown up on Monday afternoon for an early payment and left, empty-handed, had talked, the way people in small towns always talked. And by Tuesday morning, 2 of her senior hands had come to her separately with their hats in their hands. And the particular look of men who needed to know if they were going to be paid. She told them yes. She told them she was resolving a banking matter and that their wages were not in question. She said it with a steadiness that she could feel costing her something. Some reserve she had been drawing on since February that was not bottomless, that had a floor she was getting dangerously close to. They nodded and thanked her and went back to work, and she closed the study door and stood with her back against it in the silence and breathed. The ledgers were open on the desk. The numbers had not changed since she last looked at them. They were not going to change on their own. She pushed off the door and sat back down and picked up her pen and started working through the problem the only way she knew how. Methodically, column by column, looking for anything she had missed, any reserve or asset or receivable that could be converted to cash quickly enough to cover the week's obligations. There was not much. There was not enough. She already knew that. She kept looking anyway, because stopping felt like dying, and she was not ready to die. She was still at the desk that Tuesday evening at sundown when she heard the knock. She didn't answer it. The knock came again, 3 times. Unhurried, the rhythm of a man who was not going to leave. She set down her pen. She walked to the door and opened it, and Larry Dillon was standing on her porch with his hat in his hand, and the last of the evening light behind him, and he looked at her face, and whatever he saw, there made him go very still. She was aware, suddenly and uncomfortably, of how she must look. The shadows under her eyes, the ink on her fingers, The way she was holding the door frame with both hands like it was the only thing keeping her upright. She had not eaten since morning. She had not slept properly in 4 days. She was held together by will and stubbornness, and the Jordan family pride that had been both her inheritance and her cage for as long as she could remember, and for one unguarded moment, 1 second, before she could stop it, she felt all of it sway. He didn't say anything. He didn't offer platitudes or condolences, or the careful, professional sympathy she could have deflected without effort. He just stood there, reading her face with those steady eyes. And she felt her grip on the doorframe tighten, because the kindness in his expression was somehow harder to bear than anything Zachary had thrown at her. Cruelty she knew how to meet. Cruelty had a shape she could push against. This was different. This had no edge to brace against, and she was too tired to find one. She stepped back from the door. He came in. She didn't offer him a seat this time either, but she walked back to the study and he followed, and she showed him the letter without preamble. Just picked it up from the desk and held it out and let him read it. She watched his jaw tighten as he read. She watched him set the letter down carefully, the way you set something down when what you want to do is something very different. The judge, he said. Harlan Burke. He's Terry's man. Can you prove on it? She almost laughed. She didn't. She sat down in her father's chair and looked at the ledgers and felt the exhaustion of the past 6 months settle across her shoulders like a physical weight. The sleepless nights and the difficult meetings and the careful, composed face she had been wearing every day like armor, and the barn and the letter and the numbers on the page that did not add up, no matter how many times she looked at them. She felt Larry move, not toward her, not in the way that would have made her put the wall back up immediately, just to the side of the desk, where he sat down on the edge of the windowsill and looked out at the darkening yard. He didn't speak. He didn't try to fix it or explain it or offer her a plan. He just stayed. And that, the simple, uncomplicated fact of another person staying, not leaving, not requiring anything from her, just being present in the room while she sat in the wreckage of her father's life's work, was the thing that almost undid her. Almost. She pressed her hands flat on the ledgers. She breathed. She looked at the numbers until they steadied. Then she picked up her pen. I need to find a way to cover the supplier payments by Friday, she said. Her voice was even. He turned from the window. I know someone at the Omaha branch, he said. A manager who's independent of Burke. If we can get the account transfer documented and filed with him directly, it might be enough to unfreeze the funds temporarily while the inquiry is challenged. She looked at him. How long would that take? If I ride to Omaha tomorrow morning, I can be back by Friday. She held his gaze for a moment. Outside the window, the last of the light was gone, and the Nebraska night was coming in dark and total. She thought about the schoolhouse gate. She thought about the boy she had looked away from, and the man he had become, and the 4 years he had spent, being the law in a town that had not always made it easy. She thought about how much she did not want to need him, and how little that wanting had to do with anything anymore. Ride to Omaha, she said. It cost her something to say it. She suspected he knew that. He nodded once, put on his hat, and walked out into the dark without making anything of it, which was, she admitted to herself, alone in the study with the ink drying on her pen, exactly the right thing to do. Larry rode to Omaha and back in 2 days. He returned on a Friday morning with a document from the independent bank manager and rode straight to the Jordan estate without stopping at the jailhouse first, which was the kind of thing he would have done for no one else in Bellevue. and which he did not examine too closely. The document was enough, barely, but enough, to challenge Burke's freeze order on procedural grounds and restore temporary access to the accounts while the inquiry was formally contested. He left it with Stephanie's lawyer and went to the jailhouse, and slept for 4 hours, and woke up to find a note on his desk from Deputy Hess that said Terry Zachary had been seen at the courthouse that morning in a long meeting with Judge Burke. Larry read the note twice. He folded it into his breast pocket next to his notebook. He went to find out what had been decided in that meeting, and what he found sent him back out into the Bellevue afternoon, with a cold and particular fury that he had learned over 4 years of wearing a badge to keep entirely off his face. Terry had filed a public notice. It was posted on the board outside the courthouse by noon. A legal announcement, formally worded, declaring that pursuant to the financing agreement signed by the late Robert Jordan, and in light of the ongoing inquiry into the Jordan account irregularities, the northern trade routes held as collateral under said agreement were now subject to a claim of transfer pending final adjudication. It was not a final ruling. It was not a seizure. It was something more calculated than either of those things. It was a public declaration, posted where every merchant and supplier and business partner in Bellevue could read it, that the Jordan fur trade was legally contested and financially unstable. It was Terry Zachary telling the town, in the language of courts and documents, that the Jordan name was no longer safe to do business with, and it was timed. Larry understood this immediately and completely. For the afternoon of the Bellevue merchant gathering, every significant business owner in town met on the last Friday of the month at the Assembly Hall on Main Street to discuss trade and contracts and the general commerce of the region. Terry had posted the notice 3 hours before that meeting. By the time the merchants sat down together that afternoon, every one of them would have read it. Every one of them would be making a calculation about the Jordan accounts and the Jordan routes and the wisdom of honoring contracts with a business whose future was now a matter of public, legal dispute. It was elegant in the way that a knife between the ribs was elegant, precise, quiet, and designed to do maximum damage with minimum visible effort. Larry found Stephanie at the estate. She had already seen it. One of her suppliers had sent a boy with a copy of the notice and a politely worded letter explaining that he would need to suspend their arrangement pending resolution of the legal matter. She was standing at the window of the study when Larry arrived, and she was not crying, and she was not shaking, and she was not doing any of the things a person might reasonably do upon watching their life's work being systematically dismantled in public. She was simply standing very still, with the notice in her hand and the supplier's letter on the desk behind her, looking out at the yard with an expression that Larry had not seen on her face before. Not grief, not fear, something harder than either, something that had been forged, he suspected, over 6 months of mornings that started before dawn at a dead man's desk, of meetings held and hands shaken and walls kept standing through pure and unreasonable will. She had been pushed as far back as a person could go and still be standing, and whatever was in her face now was what lived at that edge. He had a deep and sudden respect for it that surprised him with its force. "The merchant meeting is in 2 hours," he said. She turned from the window. "I know. He'll be there. I know that too." She set the notice down on the desk. She smoothed it flat with one hand, the same gesture he had watched her use on difficult documents before. Not in defeat, but in the manner of a woman taking the full measure of something before she decided what to do with it. "Then I'll be there as well," she said. He started to say something cautionary and stopped himself because she was already moving, already walking toward the door with the set of her shoulders. That meant the conversation was over and the decision was made, and he had learned enough about Stephanie Jordan in the past weeks to know that the cautionary thing would cost him more than it was worth. He followed her instead. They arrived at the assembly hall separately. She in her mother's black carriage, composed and unhurried, he on horseback from the other direction, and the room was already full when she walked in. Larry watched from the back. He watched the way the conversation shifted when she entered. The slight pause, the exchanged glances, the recalibration of men who had read the notice and were now looking at the subject of it, walking through the door with her chin level and her back straight and her face arranged in the particular expression of a woman who had not come to beg. Zachary was at the front of the room near the window, talking to two merchants, and he saw her come in and his smile did not change, but something behind his eyes did. A sharpening, a recalculation, the expression of a man revising his timeline. He let her get settled. He let the meeting begin its ordinary business. He waited, with the patience of someone who had been planning this for a long time, until the room had found its rhythm and its guard was down. Then he stood up. He spoke with the measured authority of a man addressing a civic concern. He expressed, with great apparent reluctance, his worry about the instability of certain business arrangements currently under legal review. He spoke about the responsibility of the merchant community to protect itself from unnecessary risk. He did not name her. He didn't need to. Every set of eyes in the room moved to Stephanie anyway, the way eyes move toward the person a story is about, even when their name goes unspoken. Larry watched her from the back of the room. He watched her sit straight and still and receive it. The glances, the murmuring, the public unraveling of everything she had spent 6 months holding together. With a composure that cost her, visibly that he could see costing her in the set of her jaw and the particular stillness of her hands in her lap. And then Terry reached into his coat and produced the financing agreement and held it up and said, clearly enough for the whole room to hear, that he was prepared to resolve the matter simply and fairly and in a manner that protected the Jordan name and honored Robert Jordan's memory. All that was required was Miss Jordan's cooperation. He looked at her when he said it. The room looked at her, 30 pairs of eyes waiting. She stood up. The room went quiet. Larry straightened from the wall. She looked at Zachary across the assembled merchants of Bellevue, not Nebraska, and she said in a voice that did not waver by a single degree, "My father built every trade route in that agreement with his own hands over 30 years. This business is not for sale, it is not for transfer, and it is not subject to the cooperation of anyone in this room except me. If Mr. Zachary has a legal claim he believes is legitimate, he is welcome to pursue it through the courts, where I will meet him." She paused. "And where the full history of his business arrangements in Kearney and Omaha will also be available for review." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. Terry's smile stayed in place, but something underneath it shifted. A tightening, barely visible, the expression of a man who had just heard something he hadn't expected and was deciding how to absorb it. Around the room, the merchants were very still. Larry felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized had been wound tight. She sat back down. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked straight ahead. The meeting resumed, uneasily, around the shape of what had just happened. Terry did not speak again, but Larry caught his eye once across the room, and what he saw there had nothing to do with patience anymore. They didn't speak on the ride back from the assembly hall. She was in the carriage, and he was on horseback, and there was no reason for either of them to stop. The night was cold, the town was watching, and they were both the kind of people who did not perform their private lives in public. But when the carriage turned up the estate road and he followed without being asked, she did not tell him to go. She let the driver take the horses around back, and she unlocked the front door herself and walked into the entrance hall and left the door open behind her, which was as close to an invitation as she had ever offered him, and which he understood without it being explained. He tied his horse at the gate and followed her in. The fire in the study hearth had burned low. She knelt and built it back up with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had been doing her own fires since February. And when it caught, she stood and pushed her hair back from her face and turned around, and he was standing in the doorway, watching her with an expression she didn't have the energy to deflect tonight. The assembly hall was still too close. Terry's smile was still too fresh in her memory. She had held herself together in that room through sheer force of will, and now the will was spent, and the walls were down, and she was standing in her father's study, in the firelight with Larry Dillon, looking at her like she was something worth looking at, and she was too tired to pretend she didn't feel it. She sat down on the settee by the fire. He came and sat across from her, not close, not crowding, the careful distance of a man who understood that proximity was a thing you had to be given. For a while, neither of them said anything. The fire popped and settled. Outside, the Nebraska night was enormous and still. She looked at her hands in her lap, ink-stained, slightly raw from the cold, the hands of a woman who had been working too hard for too long. And then she looked up at him. "I used to practice that," she said. He looked at her, the composed face. "My mother taught me." She said, "A Jordan woman never lets a room see her bleed." She paused. "I've been practicing it every day since February." He was quiet for a moment. "It's a good face," he said. "It's an exhausting one," she said. Something shifted between them at that. Something small and significant. The way a door shifts when the latch releases. Not open yet, but no longer locked. She looked at the fire. "I owe you something," she said. He shook his head. "You don't." "I do." She looked at him directly, with the same unflinching steadiness she had used on Zachary, across the assembly hall. Except that this was entirely different, because this was true, and Terry had never been anything but a performance. "The schoolhouse gate," she said. "I was 12 years old, and I was cruel, and I have thought about it more times than I would ever have admitted to anyone." He was very still. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. "That's not why I'm saying it." He looked at the fire for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was even, unhurried, the voice of a man who had made his peace with something a long time ago, and was now simply describing it accurately. "I went home that afternoon and I told my father what happened," he said. He said, "And I remember this exactly," he said, "That's the shape of the world, son. You can either let it flatten you, or you can use it to build something worth standing on." She was watching him. "And did you?" she asked. "Use it to build something?" The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something quieter than that. "I got the badge, didn't I?" She looked at him. The firelight was warm across his face, and he was looking at her with that expression again. The one she had been encountering for weeks now, without the right word for it. And she understood, suddenly, and completely what the word was. It was tenderness. Not the soft, careful tenderness of someone handling something fragile. The kind that comes from paying attention to a person for a very long time and knowing them truly and choosing them anyway. She had spent 20 years dismissing this man by the shape of his boots and the name of his father, and the side of town he came from, and he had spent 20 years becoming someone that the girl she used to be could never have deserved, and they were both sitting here in the wreckage of 6 of the hardest months of her life, and she felt something move in her chest that she hadn't felt since before the telegram, something warm and alive and terrifying in the way that only real things are terrifying. She looked away first, back at the fire, back at her hands. She breathed. "He's going to come at us harder now," she said. "After tonight." "Yes," Larry said. "He'll move fast. A man like that, once he's been embarrassed publicly, he stops being patient." "What does that look like?" "It looks like he stops using paper," Larry said quietly. She understood what he meant. She nodded once. The warmth in her chest did not go away, but she set it aside the way she set everything aside that she couldn't afford right now, carefully, in a place she could find again later. "The proof," she said. "The holding company, the deed, Burke. Where are we?" He reached into his breast pocket and produced his notebook, the small leather one she had seen him write in before, and opened it on the table. Between them, she leaned forward. He leaned forward. Their heads were close together over the notebook in the firelight, and neither of them remarked on it, and for a while they simply worked. Two people who had started as the farthest possible thing from allies, bent over a problem together in the dark, and something about the ordinariness of it, the simple shared purpose of it, felt more intimate than anything else that had passed between them. He talked through what he had. She asked questions. He answered them. She pointed to 2 entries in the notebook and told him about a business contact in Omaha her father had trusted, a man named Garrett, who had once flagged irregularities in a land transaction involving the same holding company 3 years earlier, and who might, if approached carefully, be willing to speak. Larry wrote the name down. She watched his handwriting, small and precise, the handwriting of a man who had taught himself carefully, and felt the tenderness move through her again, quieter this time, more settled, like something finding its right place after a long time in the wrong one. They worked until the fire burned low again. When he finally stood to leave, she walked him to the door, and they stood for a moment on the porch in the cold night air, and she said, "Be careful, Larry." It was the first time she had used his name. They both heard it. He looked at her for a moment, with that expression she now had the word for, and then he put on his hat and walked down the porch steps and untied his horse and rode off into the dark, and she stood on the porch and watched him go, and did not go back inside until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely into the Nebraska night. Larry found Garrett in Omaha on a Wednesday. The man was older than he expected, heavyset, cautious, with the careful eyes of someone who had once touched something dangerous and still carried the memory of it in his hands. He received Larry in the back office of a shipping company on the River District, away from windows, with a cup of coffee he didn't drink, and a posture that said he had been expecting this visit for longer than Larry had been planning it. Larry laid out what he had: the holding company, the financing agreement, the deed clause, Judge Burke, the barn, the frozen accounts, the merchant meeting. And Garrett listened without interrupting. And when Larry finished, Garrett was quiet for a long time. Then he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and produced a folder that was thicker than Larry's own. And he set it on the table between them and said, "I've been holding this for 3 years, waiting for someone with a badge to come through that door." The folder contained everything. Bank records showing the holding company was wholly owned by Zachary through 2 layers of proxy registration. Correspondence between Terry and Judge Burke, dating back 4 years, including 2 payments disguised as legal consulting fees. A signed statement from a land agent in Kearney who had facilitated one of the previous estate acquisitions and had been carrying the guilt of it ever since. And at the back of the folder, behind everything else, a document that made Larry go very still. A record of a meeting between Terry, Zachary, and 2 men known to operate as hired outriders in the territory held 6 days before Robert and Catherine Jordan had left Bellevue on their final trip north. He looked at Garrett. Garrett looked back. Neither of them said the thing the document implied, because saying it turned it from evidence into accusation, and accusation without a courtroom was just noise. But they both knew. Larry closed the folder. He thanked Garrett. He rode back to Bellevue through the night without stopping. He arrived at dawn on Friday to find his deputy Hess waiting at the jailhouse gate with a look that meant something had already happened. Terry had moved. 2 of his hired men had been seen at the Jordan estate the previous evening. Not inside, not yet, but at the perimeter, visible enough to be seen and meant to be seen. The way a threat positions itself when it wants to be understood without being spoken. Hess had ridden out and they had gone, but they had gone slowly, without urgency, the way men go when they want you to know they'll be back. Larry left the folder with Hess, with instructions to keep it locked, and rode straight to the estate. Stephanie met him at the door before he could knock. She had been awake. He could see it. She looked at his face and read it the way she had learned to read it over the past weeks. The jaw, the eyes, the particular set of his shoulders, when something was both worse and better than expected. And she stepped back and let him in without a word. He sat down across from her at the study desk and opened his saddlebag and laid out everything Garrett had given him, piece by piece, in the order that told the story most clearly. She read it all. She read the bank records and the correspondence and the Kearney statement. She read the last document, the meeting record, the 2 outriders, the date 6 days before her parents left. And he watched her face go through something that he could not name and did not try to. She set it down. She was very still. Outside the window, Bellevue was waking up. The sounds of a town beginning its ordinary Friday wagons and voices, and the smell of wood smoke from morning fires. And inside the study, the silence had the weight of everything the last document implied. He had them killed, she said. Her voice was flat, precise. The voice of a woman who had suspected it for weeks and was now simply saying it aloud for the first time. The document doesn't say that directly, Larry said carefully, but it puts him in a room with those men 6 days before. It's enough. For a judge, yes. For a jury, yes. She looked at him. Is Burke still on the bench? Not after today, Larry said. He had already sent a rider to the circuit court in Lincoln the previous evening with a sealed copy of the Burke correspondence. By afternoon, there would be a federal inquiry. Burke would be suspended pending investigation before sundown. Terry would know it by nightfall. And that Larry had been turning this over for the entire ride back from Omaha was when it would get dangerous. Because a man like Terry Zachary, careful and patient and methodical his entire life, stripped suddenly of his judge and his legal cover and his timeline, with the net closing from 3 directions at once, was no longer the man who sent letters and posted notices and froze accounts. He became something rawer and more unpredictable, and raw and unpredictable men did things that careful men never would. He told her this. She listened. She nodded. She did not tell him she wasn't afraid, which he appreciated, because it would have been a lie, and they were past lying to each other. What do we do? She said. I'm going to arrest him, Larry said. Now this morning, before he hears about Burke, he'll have men with him. I know. Hess isn't enough. I know that too. He had been thinking about this on the ride back. He had 2 deputies, Hess and a younger man named Cole, who was capable enough in a straight situation, but had never faced hired guns. Terry's men were not hired guns exactly, but they were frontier hard, and they were loyal to whoever was paying them. And there were at least 3 of them that Larry had identified. The math was not comfortable. He was working through it when Stephanie stood up. She walked to the cabinet in the corner of the study, the one her father had kept locked, that she had unlocked herself the week after the funeral. And she opened it and took out a Winchester rifle and checked it with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had grown up on a frontier estate and knew exactly what the cabinet was for. He looked at her. "You're not coming," he said. She looked back at him over the rifle. "My father is dead," she said. "My mother is dead. My barn is ash. My accounts were frozen." He stood up in front of every merchant in this town and tried to take my name. She levered around into the chamber with a sound that was extremely final. "I am absolutely coming." He looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was coming through the study window, and it was falling across her face, and she was looking at him with that chin-level, shoulders-back composure that he had watched hold together through 6 months of things that would have broken most people. And underneath it now was something else. The thing that had been building since the barn, since the letter, since the assembly hall, since the night they had bent over his notebook together in the firelight. A fury so clean and so earned that it was almost beautiful. He thought about telling her no. He thought about the 12 different ways this could go wrong. He thought about the look on her face the night of the barn fire, standing in the ash with her hands pressed flat against her thighs so no one would see them shake. "Stay behind me," he said, "until I say otherwise." "Agreed," she said. They rode into Bellevue together in the sharp Friday morning light. The sheriff and the heiress, side by side on the main street of a town that had watched them from opposite ends of its social order their entire lives. And the people on the sidewalks stopped and watched them pass, and nobody said a word, because there are moments in a town's life when it understands, without being told, that something is ending and something else is beginning, and this was one of them. Terry Zachary's office was at the end of Main Street, in a building that had his name on the door in gold letters. Larry dismounted. He checked his pistol. He looked at Stephanie once. She was watching the building with an expression that had no name in any language he knew, but that he understood completely. He turned back to the door. He knocked it open with his boot and walked inside and said, "Terry Zachary, you're under arrest." The room erupted. The first man came from the left, big, fast, faster than Larry had expected, and caught him across the shoulder before he could fully turn. Larry went into the wall hard. He heard Hess shout from the doorway. He heard a second man moving behind him and dropped low, and the shot that was meant for his chest hit the door frame instead. And then everything was very loud and very fast and very close. He caught the first man with his elbow on the backswing and put him down. The second man, younger, rattled by the noise, hesitated half a second too long, and Larry had his pistol up before the hesitation was over. "Down," Larry said. The man went down. From somewhere behind him, he heard Terry's voice, high and stripped of its careful smoothness, shouting something at a third man who was moving toward the back window, and then a sound he recognized, the lever-action click of a Winchester being cocked, and Terry's third man stopped moving entirely. Larry turned. Stephanie was standing in the doorway with the rifle up, and her eyes level and her hands completely steady. and she was looking at Terry Zachary's last hired man with an expression that communicated, without any room for misinterpretation, that she had not come this far to stop now. The man put his hands up. Terry was standing behind his desk. The gold letters on the door were catching the morning light. He looked at Larry. He looked at Stephanie. He looked at the folder under Larry's arm, Garrett's folder. The one with the bank records, and the correspondence and the meeting record, and whatever was left of a careful, patient, methodical man he had always been went out of his face all at once, leaving something smaller and older and afraid. "It's over, Terry," Larry said. Terry sat down. It was the most defeated thing Larry had ever seen a man do. The trial lasted 4 days. It was held in the Bellevue courthouse in the second week of October, under a circuit judge sent down from Lincoln named Alderman, who had the reputation of a man who had seen everything and was impressed by none of it, and who read Garrett's folder on the evening of his arrival, and came to court the following morning with the particular expression of a judge who has already made up his mind about the shape of a thing and is simply waiting for the evidence to confirm it. Terry Zachary sat at the defendant's table in the same pressed coat he had worn to Stephanie's front door on the afternoon of the ultimatum, except that the coat looked different now. Smaller somehow, less authoritative, the way expensive things look when the person wearing them has been reduced. His lawyer was competent and worked hard, and it didn't matter. Garrett testified. The Kearney land agent testified. 2 of Terry's hired men, offered reduced sentences in exchange for cooperation, testified. The bank records were entered into evidence. The correspondence with Judge Burke, who was facing his own separate inquiry in Lincoln, and had aged, by all accounts, 10 years in 2 weeks, was entered into evidence. The financings agreement was entered into evidence, with Alderman spending a long time on the 3rd-page clause, and asking Terry's lawyer 3 questions about it, that the lawyer answered with decreasing confidence each time. On the 3rd day, Larry took the stand and walked the court through the timeline, from the barn fire to the frozen accounts to the merchant meeting to Garrett's folder, in the flat, precise voice of a man who had organized 4 years of evidence into 40 minutes of testimony, and when he was done, the courtroom was very quiet. On the 4th day, Stephanie took the stand. She wore her mother's black dress. She sat straight. She answered every question in a clear, measured voice, and she did not look at Terry Zachary once, not because she was afraid to, but because he was no longer worth the attention. When the prosecutor asked her to describe the night the telegram arrived, she paused for just a moment, one breath barely visible, and then she described it. And the courtroom stayed very quiet, and 2 women in the gallery were crying by the time she finished, and the judge was looking at the desk in front of him with the expression of a man keeping something carefully off his face. The verdict came back in 2 hours. Guilty on all counts: extortion, fraud, corruption of a public official, and conspiracy in connection with the deaths of Robert and Catherine Jordan. That last count was the one that mattered. That last count was the one that turned extortion into something that couldn't be reduced or negotiated or papered over, that put a name on what had been done to her family on a mountain pass outside Scottsbluff, and made it a matter of public record in the Bellevue courthouse where everyone could see it. Terry Zachary was taken from the courtroom in chains. He did not look at Stephanie as he was led past. She watched him go with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, and her face arranged in the composed, unreadable expression her mother had taught her. Except that it was different now. It was not armor anymore. It was just her face. The face of a woman who had come through something and was still standing and knew it, and did not need anyone in the room to confirm it. When the doors closed behind him, she exhaled once slowly and looked down at her hands in her lap, and for the first time in a very long time she let them rest without pressing them flat against anything. Outside the courthouse, Bellevue was waiting. That was the only way to describe it. The town had turned out the way it turns out for things that matter, the way it had turned out for her parents' funeral. Except that this was different because this was not grief. This was something the town owed her, and knew it owed her, and was paying in the only currency available to a community that had looked the other way for too long. Merchants who had suspended their contracts were there. Suppliers who had disappeared at the first sign of trouble were there. Neighbors who had sent flowers and then quietly calculated the value of the Jordan estate in the weeks after the funeral were there. She walked down the courthouse steps, and they parted for her, and some of them nodded, and some of them spoke, and she received it all with the same measured courtesy her mother had taught her, because the Jordans did not perform their victories in public any more than they performed their grief. Larry was waiting at the bottom of the steps with his hat in his hand. She stopped in front of him. Around them the town moved and murmured, and gave them a space that felt almost deliberate, as though Bellevue understood that what passed between these two people on these steps was not its business. She looked at him. He looked at her. There were 20 years between them, and 6 months of the hardest kind of closeness, and a barn full of ash, and a folder full of evidence, and a name finally said aloud on a porch in the dark, and none of it needed to be summarized, because they had both lived it, and they both knew what it amounted to. "Your father would have liked you," she said. It was not what she had planned to say. She hadn't planned anything. It came from somewhere below planning, from the place where the true things lived that she had spent her whole life keeping composed and controlled and at a careful distance. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his face. Not surprise, not the careful steadiness she had come to know so well. Something quieter and more open than either. "Yours would have liked you too," he said. He already did. She felt it move through her, warm and real and entirely undefended. The thing she had been setting aside since the night of the notebook and the firelight. The thing she had promised herself she would find again when it was over. It was over. She found it. She reached out and took his hand, right there on the courthouse steps in front of all of Bellevue, and she held it, and he held hers back. And neither of them said anything else because there was nothing else that needed saying. The Jordan fur trade reopened its northern routes 3 weeks later, under full legal ownership, with the financing agreement nullified by court order and the holding company dissolved. The first shipment of the season went out on a cold November morning, with a sky the color of pewter and the smell of coming snow in the air. Stephanie stood at the estate gate and watched the wagon roll down the road, her father's road, her road now. And she stood straight, and she breathed the cold air, and she felt for the first time since February something that was not grief or endurance or the exhausted satisfaction of having survived. She felt like herself, not the self she had been before the telegram. That girl was gone, and she did not want her back. The self she had become in the 6 months since, the one who had sat on the floor of the entrance hall in the dark and gotten back up, the one who had stood in the ash and not broken, the one who had taken a man's hand on courthouse steps in front of a whole town and not flinched. Behind her she heard the gate open. Slow, familiar footsteps on the path. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She felt him come and stand beside her, and together they watched the wagon until it rounded the bend in the road and disappeared into the Nebraska morning, carrying the Jordan name forward into whatever came next. In Bellevue, Nebraska, in the year 1880, justice was not always fast. It was not always clean. It did not always come when you called for it, or wear the face you expected. Sometimes it came in the form of a man with worn boots and an audacious streak, and 4 years of patient, careful work. Sometimes it cost everything you had before it gave you anything back. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes in the stories worth telling, it arrived exactly when it was supposed to, and it brought with it something you hadn't known you were waiting for. And it left the world a little more like it should have been all along. That's the thing about the sheriff's desk. Every case closes, eventually. Every town gets the justice it's willing to fight for. And every now and then, if you're paying attention, the law and the heart end up pointing in the same direction. This has been a lost tale from the sheriff's desk. If this story moved you, if you felt the weight of Stephanie's grief, or the patience of Larry's love, or the cold satisfaction of watching Zachary walk out of that courtroom in chains, then you already know what this channel is about. Every town had a law. Every law had a story. And there are more stories waiting at this desk than I will ever have time to tell alone. So hit that like button. Subscribe if you're new here. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one, and you have no idea how much it matters. The next story is already waiting, and trust me, you're going to want to be here for it.